Sign the papers, Nia, or there won't be a wedding. Julian's voice cracked like a whip through the grand ballroom. He didn't just say it, his fingers dug into her bare shoulder, his grip so vicious that the delicate lace of her gown tore with a sickening rip. 500 elite guests gasped in unison. Then a suffocating silence fell over the room. One by one, the glowing screens of camera phones emerged from the sea of designer suits and gowns. Julian snatched the officiant's microphone from its stand. "I want everyone to witness this," he boomed, his face contorted in rage. "This woman is nothing without my family's money. She refuses to merge her family's failing assets, so I am ending this right now." He shoved her hard, her ankle twisting. A single white stiletto slipped from her foot, clattering against the marble. She collapsed into a sea of white silk and scattered roses, tears streaming down her face as she clutched her torn bodice. Julian stepped forward, raising his hand to force the pen into her trembling fingers. But before his hand could fall, the shadows at the back of the hall seemed to part. While the room was paralyzed by the scandal, a man in a flawless, pitch-black suit, with dark ink creeping up his neck, moved silently down the aisle. He didn't rush, he didn't shout, he simply glided toward the altar, kneeling beside Nia. Gently, he slid one arm securely around her waist, shielding her trembling body against his chest as he stood up, taking her weight effortlessly. "Get your hands off her! Who the hell are you?" Julian roared through the speakers, pointing a trembling finger at the stranger. The man didn't flinch. He turned his head slowly, his dark, cold eyes locked onto Julian. "Touch her again," Do-Yun said softly. He didn't use a microphone, but the sheer, paralyzing terror in his tone made the entire wedding freeze. Before we find out what happens next, please hit that subscribe button, leave a like, and comment below telling me where you're watching from, because this story is about to take a wild turn. The heavy oak doors of the cathedral slammed shut, cutting off the frantic shouts of the wedding guests and the blinding flashes of cell phone cameras. Nia's heart hammered against her ribs, her breath catching in her throat as the cool evening air hit her tear-stained face. She was still clutching the torn bodice of her ruined silk gown, trembling uncontrollably. Beside her, Do-Yun moved with a terrifying, fluid grace. He didn't speak, as he gently but firmly guided her toward a sleek, heavily armored black SUV, waiting idling at the curb. The ride was a blur of neon city lights and a heavy, suffocating silence. Nia stared at her hands, the phantom pain of Julian's bruising grip still burning her skin. She dared a glance at the man beside her. Do-Yun was staring out the window, his expression unreadable, the dark ink on his neck fading into the shadows of the plush leather interior. He was a phantom, a rumor whispered only in the darkest, most dangerous corners of the city. Yet here he was, her improbable shield. When the vehicle finally glided into a subterranean garage, a team of sharply dressed, armed guards seamlessly surrounded them. Do-Yun led her into a private, fingerprint-locked elevator that shot upward, ascending far above the chaotic streets. When the metal doors parted, Nia stepped into a sprawling, glass-walled penthouse. The glittering skyline stretched out below them in a panoramic expanse. It was a fortress in the sky. She was entirely isolated from the world she knew, miles above the reach of anyone who could hurt her. There were no dark corners here, just expansive light, cold marble, and impenetrable security. "You are safe here," Do-Yun said, his deep voice finally breaking the stillness. He gestured to a sprawling velvet sofa. "Sit." As she sank into the plush cushions, her legs finally giving out, a man in a gray suit appeared from a hallway, handing Do-Yun a slim digital tablet. Do-Yun's dark eyes scanned the glowing screen before he looked back up, locking his gaze with hers. "Julian's leverage over you relied on a series of predatory holding companies. My syndicate's financial division has just initiated a total override of those assets. Your family's legacy has been completely severed from his accounts and routed into an anonymous, heavily encrypted trust. Nia stopped breathing, the sheer magnitude of his words washing over her. Julian is locked out, Do-yoon continued, handing the tablet back to his associate. You have no access to your money, your properties, or your family's name. He has nothing. The financial chains that had forced her to the altar, the threats that had kept her paralyzed, shattered in a matter of minutes. Why? She whispered, her voice barely carrying across the vast room. Do-yoon stepped closer. His towering presence cast a long shadow, yet as he looked down at her, the terrifying coldness in his eyes melted into an unexpected, grounding warmth. Because some things, he murmured softly, his gaze dropping briefly to the torn lace on her bruised shoulder, are too precious to be left in the hands of careless men. The morning sun bled through the floor-to-ceiling windows of the penthouse, casting long golden shadows across the unfamiliar bedroom. Nia sat huddled in the center of the massive king-sized bed, her knees pulled tight to her chest. She had spent the night staring at the city lights, the terrifying echo of Julian's voice still trapped in her mind. Every time she closed her eyes, she felt the phantom sting of his fingers digging into her bruised shoulder and the humiliating rip of her wedding gown. She was entirely isolated here, suspended above the world in this glass fortress, yet for the first time in months, she didn't feel hunted. A soft, rhythmic knock broke the heavy silence. Nia flinched, her breath hitching as the heavy mahogany door eased open. Do-yin stepped into the room. The terrifying, lethal aura that had paralyzed 500 guests at the cathedral was entirely absent. He was dressed down in a simple, dark cashmere sweater that softened the sharp, predatory lines of his shoulders, though the ink trailing up his neck remained a stark reminder of who he truly was. In his hands, he carried a small silver tray holding a steaming porcelain cup and a folded stack of soft gray lounge clothes. He didn't cross the threshold entirely. He paused, his dark eyes scanning her trembling frame, reading the lingering terror in her posture. "I had my staff bring up some tea," Do-yin said, his voice a low, steady rumble that commanded calm rather than fear. "Chamomile, and something more comfortable to wear." He walked slowly to the edge of the room, setting the tray down on a small glass table near the door, intentionally keeping a wide, respectful distance between them. Julian would have invaded her space, demanded her gratitude, and forced her to smile. Do-yin merely stepped back, resting his hands casually in his pockets. "You haven't slept," he noted quietly. It wasn't an accusation, it was an observation laced with a quiet, grounding empathy. "I keep waiting for the door to be kicked in," Nia whispered, her voice raspy and fragile. "I keep waiting for the catch." Do-yun's expression shifted, a flicker of dangerous resolve crossing his features before settling back into composed stillness. "There is no catch, Nia, and there is no door in this city that I cannot hold shut." He held her gaze, demanding nothing, simply offering an absolute, unbreakable truth. "You are not a prisoner here. You can walk into the elevator whenever you wish, but as long as you choose to stay, no one will ever lay a hand on you in anger again." He gave her a single, respectful nod and left, turning away, leaving the quiet comfort of the room intact. As the door clicked shut softly behind him, Nia looked at the steaming tea. A strange, hesitant warmth fluttered in her chest. The monster the city feared was turning out to be the only true sanctuary she had ever known. The heavy thud of a fist meeting leather echoed through the expansive, glass-walled training room. Nia breathed heavily, sweat dampening her hairline as she stared at the heavy bag suspended from the ceiling. She had spent the last week hiding behind the impenetrable walls of the penthouse, wrapped in the quiet sanctuary Do-yun had provided. But safety wasn't enough anymore. The lingering terror was slowly morphing into a cold, hardened resolve. Again, Do-yun commanded softly. He stood beside the bag, stripped of his usual suit jacket, the sleeves of his dark dress shirt rolled up to reveal the intricate, terrifying ink winding up his forearms. Nia stepped forward and threw another strike, her knuckles wrapped in padded tape. It was weak, her footing uncertain. Do-yun stepped into her space, moving with that same fluid, lethal grace. He didn't mock her hesitation. Instead, he reached out, his large, calloused hands gently adjusting her stance. "Julian used his size to intimidate you," he murmured, his voice a low vibration that demanded absolute focus. "But power isn't just about weight, it's about leverage." He guided her hips, carefully aligning her shoulders. "Don't just swing, drive the force from the ground up." She took a deep breath, closing her eyes. She summoned the phantom pain of the bruising grip on her shoulder, the humiliating sound of tearing silk, the years of quiet subjugation. Her eyes snapped open. She pivoted, snapping her hip forward, and slammed her fist into the heavy leather with a resounding, violent crack. A sharp exhale left her lips, followed by a sudden, liberating rush of adrenaline. Do-yun's lips twitched into a rare, faint shadow of a smile. "Better." He handed her a towel and gestured toward a sleek glass conference table at the far end of the room, where thick stacks of legal files awaited. "Now we teach you how to hit him where it actually matters." As she wiped her face and took a seat, Do-yun's lead counsel, a sharp-eyed man in a gray suit, slid a silver pen and a thick dossier across the glass. "Julian's holding companies are bleeding. We locked him out of your family's assets, but he is desperately trying to leverage a few parasitic contracts, still tying your name to his corporate debts. I could erase them quietly." He paused, his gaze dropped to the silver pen. "Or you can sign these injunctions and drag him through a public, devastating financial ruin. You can dismantle him yourself." Nia stared at the pen. A week ago, a pen was a tool of her subjugation, forced into her hand under the threat of violence. Now, under Do-yun's towering, protective shadow, it was a weapon. She wasn't just a survivor hiding in a glass tower anymore. Without a trace of hesitation, she picked up the pen and signed her name in bold, unbreakable strokes, ready to burn Julian's remaining world to the ground. The glittering sanctuary of the penthouse remained untouched, but far below, in the neon-drenched underbelly of the city, the atmosphere was growing toxic. Do-yun's name was rarely spoken aloud. It was a ghost story used to enforce compliance and strike terror into the hearts of rival factions. He was the untouchable apex predator of the Korean syndicate, a man who possessed no attachments, no vices, and no vulnerabilities. Until now. The whispers started in the exclusive, smoke-filled back rooms of illegal casinos and echoed through the heavily guarded shipping yards. Word had bled out from the cathedral. Do-yun, the cold and calculating boss who had systematically eradicated his opposition, had stepped into the light. He had broken his own cardinal rule of invisibility, not for territory or blood money, but for a civilian, a bride in a torn dress. In a dimly lit, soundproofed private room at the back of an underground lounge, 3 men sat around a polished mahogany table. They were the remnants of the old guard, syndicate bosses whom Do-yun had violently forced to submission years ago. "They say she is living in his personal residence," one of the men murmured, swirling a glass of amber liquid. His voice was thick with disbelief. "He has armed his inner circle to protect her, a woman with no ties to our world." A slow, dangerous smile crept across the face of the man seated at the head of the table. He leaned forward, the harsh overhead light casting deep shadows over his scarred features. For years they had waited in the dark, desperate for a crack in Do-yun's impenetrable armor. They had searched for financial weaknesses, traitorous lieutenants, and blind spots in his supply chains, finding nothing but dead ends and ruthless retaliation. "A man who cares for nothing cannot be broken," the boss rasped, his eyes gleaming with malicious intent. "But a man who builds a glass fortress to protect a single fragile bird, that man has finally given us a target." Back in the quiet serenity of the penthouse, Nia stood by the expansive window, watching the city lights pulse below. She felt stronger, the lingering bruises on her shoulder fading alongside the terror of her past. She turned as Do-yoon entered the room, the familiar, grounding warmth returning to her chest. He met her gaze, his expression composed and steady, but a barely perceptible tension tightened his jaw. Do-yoon moved to her side, his dark eyes scanning the sprawling metropolis below, as if he could see the threats multiplying in the shadows. He was a master of concealing the violence of his world, fiercely shielding her from the reality of his existence. But the storm was gathering just outside their walls. The underworld had caught the scent of blood, and the wolves were already beginning to circle. The helicopter ride had been abrupt, whisking them away from the glass tower and the suffocating, invisible tension of the city. Now, the relentless hum of the metropolis was replaced by the rhythmic, crashing roar of the ocean. Do-yoon's coastal safe house was a modernist sanctuary of dark wood and expansive glass, perched precariously on a jagged cliffside. It felt completely disconnected from the rest of the world. Nia stepped out onto the sprawling wooden deck, wrapping a thick, knitted shawl around her shoulders against the biting sea breeze. The horizon was an endless expanse of bruised purple and deep indigo as the sun dipped below the water. For the first time since the cathedral, the heavy, invisible weight that had been pressing down on her lifted completely. She heard the quiet slide of the glass door behind her. Do-yoon stepped onto the deck, the earth wind pulling at his dark hair. He wasn't wearing a suit, just a simple white shirt unbuttoned at the collar, the stark lines of his tattoos fully exposed to the fading light. He looked less like a syndicate boss here, and more like a man seeking refuge. He came to stand beside her, leaning his forearms against the heavy wooden railing. For a long time, they simply watched the violent waves batter the rocks beneath them. "It's quiet here," Nia murmured, her voice barely carrying over the wind. "It is one of the few places I can hear myself think," Do-yoon replied softly. He turned his head, his dark eyes tracing the delicate line of her profile. "And the only place I trusted to bring you right now." Nia turned to face him, searching his gaze. The impenetrable mask he wore in the city was gone. In its place was a raw, unguarded intensity that stole the breath from her lungs. "You've risked everything for me," she whispered, stepping closer, the space between them suddenly crackling with a different kind of tension. "Your rules, your empire, why?" Do-yoon didn't step back. He reached out, his large hand gently catching a loose curl that the wind had blown across her cheek, carefully tucking it behind her ear. His knuckles brushed against her skin, sending a warm, electric shock straight to her core. Nia reached up, her trembling fingers lightly resting against his chest, feeling the steady, powerful thrum of his heartbeat beneath the crisp linen. The walls they had both built, her out of fear, him out of survival, finally crumbled into the sea. She leaned up, and as his lips met hers, the chaotic world they had left behind simply ceased to exist. The rain in the city felt like a physical weight, slicking the neon-lit streets as Julian stumbled out of a cramped dive bar. He was a hollowed-out ghost of the arrogant heir who had stood at the cathedral altar just weeks ago. His tailored tuxedos were gone, replaced by a rumpled overcoat that reeked of cheap whiskey and desperation. Do-yeon's financial strike had been absolute and merciless. Julian's accounts were frozen, his credit lines were severed, and his family's prestigious name had become toxic overnight. He was bankrupt, publicly humiliated, and burning with a venomous, all-consuming need for revenge. As he turned down a dimly lit alleyway toward his dingy rented room, a heavy black sedan rolled silently to a stop beside him. The tinted rear window glided down, revealing the scarred, shadowed face of an older man. Julian didn't recognize him, but the man's dangerous aura was unmistakably tied to the underworld. Julian, the man rasped, the heavy car doors unlocking with a synchronized click. Get in. We share a mutual problem. Julian hesitated for only a fraction of a second before the intoxicating promise of vengeance outweighed his fear. He slid into the plush leather interior, finding himself flanked by two silent men in dark suits. The scarred man poured a glass of amber liquor and held it out. You hate him for taking your bride and destroying your legacy, the rival boss stated smoothly, watching Julian's hand shake as he took the glass. We hate him because he has suffocated our business for a decade. Du-Yan was untouchable, a machine, but you brought out his fatal flaw. Julian scoffed bitterly, downing the liquor. He's heavily guarded. He has a private army in that glass tower. He did, the boss corrected, a cruel smile stretching his scarred cheeks. But a man in love makes mistakes. He wants privacy. He wants to play house with your former fiancé. He's moved her out of the city. Julian's head snapped up, his bloodshot eyes widening. He took her out of the city? To the coast, the boss confirmed softly. But Du-Yan is paranoid. His localized security protocols are heavily encrypted. We need to know the physical blind spots. We know you used to review your family's coastal development contracts before he bankrupted you. You know the terrain. You know the old electrical grids on those cliffs. A slow, malicious grin spread across Julian's face, the humiliation of the past weeks crystallizing into pure, dark euphoria. He knew exactly where Du-Yan had taken her. He remembered the old blueprints of the cliffside properties, the underground utility lines, and the single, unmonitored access road that the original developers had abandoned years ago. I don't just want him dead, he snarled with manic excitement. I want to watch you burn his world down. Agreed, the rival boss murmured, pulling a digital map onto the console between them. Now show us where to strike. The quiet hum of the ocean was abruptly shattered by a deafening explosion that sent shockwaves ripping through the glass-walled retreat. Splintered wood and reinforced glass showered the grand room as the power cut instantly, plunging the coastal safe house into darkness. Alarm sirens screamed over the sound of heavy incoming gunfire. Get down, Du-Yan roared, reacting before the glass had even hit the floor. In a single fluid motion, he tackled Naya behind the solid marble island in the kitchen, shielding her body with his own. Heavy tactical boots kicked through the shattered remnants of the deck doors. Flashlights cut through the billowing smoke, revealing a dozen armed mercenaries, the rival syndicate strike team, moving with terrifying precision. Julian had given them exact access to the property's blind spots. Du-Yan pulled a heavy black handgun from a hidden holster beneath his shirt. His dark eyes were cold, calculating, and completely devoid of fear. Stay low, Naya. Do not move, he ordered, his voice an absolute command. He didn't wait for them to search the room. Du-Yan lunged out from cover, firing rapid shots with terrifying accuracy. 3 attackers dropped instantly. He moved like a ghost through the smoke, relentless and lethal, dismantling the ambush team with brutal efficiency. Every step he took was designed to draw gunfire away from where Naya cowered. Naya covered her ears, her chest heaving as bullets tore through the pristine walls above her. Through the haze, she saw Du-Yan clear the main room, his face illuminated by the flashes of gunfire. But then, a floorboard creaked directly behind the marble counter. A mercenary who had breached through a side entrance raised an automatic rifle, aiming straight at Naya's exposed back. Naya! Du-Yan's voice tore through the chaos. Without a fraction of hesitation, Du-Yan threw himself across the room. He slammed into Naya just as the mercenary pulled the trigger. A loud, sickening thud echoed through the room as a heavy round tore straight into Du-Yan's left shoulder, the impact driving him hard into the floor beside her. Pain ripped through his frame, blood instantly soaking his crisp white shirt, but he didn't scream. Rolling onto his side, he raised his weapon with his right hand and fired point blank, taking down the assailant. Silence rushed back in, heavy and suffocating, punctuated only by the distant roar of the ocean. Do-yun! Naya cried out, her hands rushing to his shoulder, instantly covered in warm, dark blood. Tears welled in her eyes, her heart shattering as she held him. Do-yun gasped, his face pale, but his grip on her hand remained tight, unbreakable. He looked into her eyes, ignoring the searing fire in his collarbone. "Are you hurt?" he rasped. Naya shook her head violently, pressing her shawl tightly against his wound. No, I'm okay. You saved me." Do-yun's jaw set into a grim, unyielding line as backup security sirens finally echoed in the distance. The strike team had failed, but his dark eyes burned with a terrifying clarity. They had almost taken her. To keep her safe forever, he would have to tear down his entire world. The heavy scent of antiseptic and gunpowder clung to Do-yun's skin. His left arm was tightly bound in a dark sling, the agonizing throb of his gunshot wound a stark reminder of how perilously close he had come to losing everything. He stood in the shadowy depths of his underground command center beneath the coastal safe house, his dark eyes fixed on a sprawling bank of glowing monitors. He wasn't reflecting on the ambush, he was orchestrating the endgame. For a decade, this sprawling criminal network had been his identity, an impenetrable fortress built on blood, fear, and ruthless efficiency. But as he watched Mia sleep safely through the reinforced glass of the adjacent medical bay, the decision required no hesitation. A king could not protect his heart if his crown continually summoned assassins to his door. Do-yun turned to his most trusted lieutenants, the men who had bled for his reign. "Initiate the blackout," he ordered, his voice cold and unwavering. With a rapid sequence of keystrokes, the foundation of the Korean underworld was systematically dismantled. Do-yun watched in silence as billions in untraceable assets were liquidated and scattered into anonymous offshore trusts. Lethal supply chains were permanently severed, extortion contracts were voided, and the heavily encrypted servers housing his syndicate's deepest secrets were wiped utterly clean before being physically incinerated. He was burning his own throne to ash. But one final violent thread remained. Within the hour, Do-yun stepped out of a black SUV into the freezing rain, his remaining enforcers flanking him. They converged on a heavily guarded warehouse at the edge of the city's industrial shipping yards. This wasn't a negotiation, it was an eradication. The rival boss, surrounded by the ragged remnants of his failed ambush team, barely had time to react. Do-yun's men breached the perimeter with terrifying speed, neutralizing the guards in a flurry of precise, silenced gunfire. Do-yun walked through the chaos like a phantom, completely unfazed by the violence surrounding him. His right hand was devastatingly steady as he raised his weapon. The rival boss backed against a rusted shipping crate, his arrogant sneer replaced by a mask of primal, suffocating fear. "You're burning your own territory to the ground," he spat, desperation bleeding into his raspy voice. "For a civilian?" "She is not a civilian," Do-yun said softly, the lethal calm in his tone far more terrifying than a shout. "She is my life." Do-yun pulled the trigger. The sharp crack of the gunshot finalized the destruction of the threat. The men who had dared to target his sanctuary were dead, and the sprawling empire that had painted a target on his back was permanently dismantled. Do-yun dropped his handgun onto the wet concrete, leaving the weapon and his violent legacy behind in the rain. When he returned to the safe house, the storm was breaking. The Phantom King was dead, leaving only the man behind to finally walk into the light. The news of the Syndicate King's demise spread through the criminal underworld like a wildfire, violent and absolute. The official story claimed Do-yun perished in the explosive collapse of a burning warehouse, a final casualty of a brutal territory war. His empire dissolved into chaos, his terrifying reign abruptly severed, and his name slowly faded back into the shadows from which he had once ruled. But miles away, hidden in a quiet, sun-drenched coastal town far beyond the reach of the city's neon glow, the ghost of the Syndicate King was sitting on a weathered wooden porch, watching the morning tide roll in. The sea breeze carried the scent of salt and blooming jasmine, a stark contrast to the gunpowder, blood, and cold marble of his past life. Do-yoon's left shoulder still bore the jagged silver scar of his sacrifice, a permanent physical reminder of the price he had paid for his freedom. Yet his posture was entirely different. His movements were no longer tight with the hyper-vigilant tension of a hunted man. He wore a simple, unbuttoned linen shirt and faded jeans, the terrifying ink on his neck now just a silent tapestry of a life he had left behind in the ashes. The screen door creaked softly behind him. Nia stepped out onto the porch, carrying 2 mugs of steaming coffee. She looked radiant. The haunted, fragile bride from the cathedral had been completely replaced by a woman entirely in control of her own peace. The shadows under her eyes were gone, and her smile was easy and unguarded. She walked barefoot across the sun-warmed wood and handed him a mug, leaning comfortably against his uninjured side. "The bookshop in town wants to know if we can come by to help with the weekend inventory," she murmured, her voice light and entirely devoid of fear. There were no armed mercenaries patrolling their perimeter. There were no bulletproof glass windows, locked subterranean garages, or heavily encrypted security protocols. There was only the rhythmic sound of the ocean and the quiet, breathtakingly ordinary life they had carved out of the wreckage of their pasts. Do-yoon set his coffee down and wrapped his arm around her waist, pulling her flush against his chest. The cold, calculating predator was gone, leaving only a man profoundly grateful for the morning sun. He rested his chin on the top of her head, breathing in the sweet, familiar scent of her hair. "Tell them we will be there," he replied, his deep voice carrying a soft, rumbling warmth that he reserved only for her. Nia smiled, turning her head to press a lingering, tender kiss to his jaw. They had burned their old worlds to the ground, her gilded cage and his violent throne, to forge this sanctuary. As they stood together on the porch, watching the bright morning light shatter across the endless expanse of blue water, the ghosts of their pasts finally went completely quiet. The storm was over, and in the warm, untouched light of their new dawn, they were simply free. And that brings us to the end of Do-yoon and Nia's journey, from the terrifying shadows of the city to the quiet, untouchable peace of the coast. They burned down an entire underworld empire just to build a sanctuary for each other, proving that even the darkest storms can lead to a beautiful new dawn. Thank you so much for tuning in and experiencing this intense ride with me. If you loved this story and want to see more gripping romances and thrilling crime sagas on the channel, please hit that subscribe button and leave a quick like. Before you click away, drop a comment below and let me know where you are watching from today. I absolutely love seeing how far across the world our community reaches. Until next time, stay safe, and I will see you in the next story.